So I'm going to move into my quad view behind here so I can see what I'm doing a little bit, and I want to select one of my translucents. Okay, so I'm going to duplicate this in place, and then I'm going to make it bigger so that we have, and I'm going to drop this forward just a little bit. I'll zoom in on that guy. And in order to update in our normal render view, our IPR isn't automatically turned on. So if you shut the window and open it back up, you need to turn it back on. Okay, great. All right, so I have a sphere within a sphere here. So the transparency, well, first I'll talk about this kind of transmission depth. So I'm going to set it to 0. Set to 0, light will not pass through any object, right? So if you have a polygonal object and you have a face, light will bounce off of it, light will reflect off of it, but it will not pass through. So I have a glass sphere with my transmission set to 0. It is kind of functioning like a black glass, even blacker than black glass, because no light's going through that. When I turn transmission to 1, light will pass through the first face of the glass, but nothing else. So now I can see through at least the front face of the sphere, but I can't see past the back side. So now transmission, excuse me. So with transmission, now we're going to start kind of bumping through each layer. So set to 1, it's going through the front face. Set to 2, it's going through the front face of the larger sphere and the back side of the larger sphere, but it's getting stuck on the internal sphere. If I set it to 3, it's going through the front of the big sphere, the front of the little sphere, the back of the big sphere, but it's getting stuck in the back side of the little sphere. So if I set this transmission to 4, now we're seeing through all 4 layers of the sphere, right? The front and the back of the big sphere, the front and the back of the little sphere. So that's the ray depth. You can kind of apply the same kind of conceptual model to things where you're not actually passing rays necessarily through objects, right? But you can see in this specular, let me turn this back to 0. Once I turn specular from 0 to 4, we start getting much kind of like reflections from the inner sphere are now reflecting on the outer sphere, and vice versa, right? With the specular just set to 1, you're basically just getting the reflections from whatever is on the outside of the object, right? So in this case, it's the HDRI image. When I turn the specular back on to something like 5 or 4, then you're starting to get reflections of reflections of reflections. And that just creates a much more realistic render. So if you're rendering out, for instance, still images, right? You definitely want to kind of ramp these things up because why not? But when you start rendering out for things like movies, you guys will find that you're trying to constantly kind of find that sweet spot in between efficiency and realistic effects. Thank you. Sorry, I'm getting kind of lost. So once I set my specular to 0, you see like I'm not getting any of the reflections from like other objects. So I no longer see the reflection of the glass in this. It's just kind of a black object, and then I'm no longer getting the reflection from the plane, which is another object in the scene. So set to 1, it will start to reflect these one object singly. Like I can see the outside of this sphere, and then when I start increasing it back up to like 4, I can start to make out kind of these two are probably reflecting back and forth, and I can start to see even through these two spheres. Maybe that could even be like this object or the smaller sphere. Okay. So these won't necessarily have to do with like the graininess, but if you're getting, they have more to do with kind of like how many light bounces back and forth and through. The transmission is going to be kind of similar, but it's talking about like light bouncing around inside of an object. And then same for like diffuse. So if I zoom in here, I can see it's still pretty grainy. So I need to increase the diffuse samples. And what I probably am going to do is just actually increase the camera samples. That's a multiplier of everything. And then maybe increase the diffuse to like 10. And then I'm going to set my render view. It's still going, so 12%. How about it? So you can tell it's just going to take a long time. What I want to do is now kind of zoom in on this sphere here and set that as a render region. All right, so that is the render settings, getting into ray depth. I'm going to set that. I think all of this sounds good for now. I'm going to clear this out. And then I'm going to go into my attribute editor for this object. So I need to select the copper sphere and then go into my AI standard surface. And I can see by default it's giving me a weight, and that's the kind of weight of the presets of the kind of base color. So set to 0, we just have a dark object, and then the weight of these color and metalness will then kind of be applied at 1, which is 100%. We talked a little. Metalness is kind of like a type of reflection, but a type of reflection that is more like a mirror, obviously, and less like a glass. Specular has to do with, again, also like similar types of reflections internally, but also kind of externally. It's a very subtle shift. Let's see here. But I know what I wanted to do. I should have done this on the glass first. This IOR, internal index of reflection, or index of refraction. So that has to do with the way that the light gets bent, and we'll come back to that. So this roughness, you can play with roughness, and then you end up with more of like a copper chrome. And then the antistrophy has to do with that kind of brushed metal kind of feel. So if I turn down the roughness, I think you can start to see that a little bit more. Yeah. So it's kind of like when you see like a brushed metal. The antistrophy has to do, and this rotation has to do with what direction the metal is being brushed, right? So you can kind of start to see that kind of banding in one direction, and moving around the sphere in a different rotation, right? So that has to do with the antistrophy and rotation. Okay, so we've covered specular, and then one more thing I'd like to cover today is the geometry. So the geometry tab is where we would go to add a bump map to an AI standard surface material. So bump mapping works very similar to other file inputs. So that little checker box next to bump mapping, select file, and then we go first to this kind of bumped depth field. So I'll mess around with this in a second. But first I'm going to actually attach the file. So we'll click on the File tab, and then click on the folder and say brick bump and say OK. And this is now driving this kind of fake texture. I can go back to the bump tab, and if I want it to be not quite as deep, I can say 0.01, and then it will look something a little bit more like an emboss. And then let's see. I think that's all I wanted to really talk about. You will notice, and actually, I will show you how to break this connection. So if you're like, no, I don't really want that bump map texture, and this is true for any of these connections. Once you have a connection here, you can see that there's a little arrow here, which is going to kind of take you down into that the file path of the kind of hyper shader logic. You can right-click on the bump mapping and say break connection. So that undoes that little connection between those two boxes. So I'm going to redo that. I'm going to actually redo the connection here and then show you in the hyper shader window too. So file and JPEG. Now it's brick texture. I can open up the hypershade window, and then I should have named these. This is why this becomes really important, because the AI standard surfaces, you don't actually get previews for them. So let's see here. Let me go in and rename this. So this is copper brick. I'll just call it copper. Okay, so yeah, it automatically updated. So this is our copper right here. So in order to graph it down here, I would need to right-click on copper and say Graph Network. So when I right-clicked over in the attribute editor over here, and I said break connection, it's basically doing the same thing that I would do here, right? So the butt map is driving this normals camera. I can select that and kind of pull it away, and it's doing the same thing, right? It's breaking the connection. Right, so I'm not going to get too far into the hypershape window. I think that is most of what I wanted to cover today. One thing that you will notice is that I did not need to uncheck the opaque tab for the AI standard surface presets, right? They will render, because they're Arnold native materials, they will render with the appropriate amount of opacity. So you don't actually need to do anything to change those. That is only if you want to render with Arnold using a Maya native material that is not opaque, translucent. Here we go, transparent. All right, so I'm going to render this scene out and just see what the materials look like, and I'll give you some render times, and I'll make any notes as far as like render settings that I needed to change. But I think that's all that I wanted to show you for the Arnold textures and ray depth settings. Okay, I hope this was useful, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye. There was a couple more things that I wanted to show you all. So I've duplicated the sphere, and then I've kind of changed some settings. So that IOR, that internal index of refraction, there's actually a chart that you can look up that tells you what all of the IORs are of various materials. So plastic is 1.460, and glass or Pyrex, or I guess Pyrex is a different IOR than glass. So 1.5 for glass, 1.46 for plastic. So I'm going to select this one on the right that I've kind of tried to turn into a plastic. So it's 1.46. And then this Antistrophy, which is also kind of talking about the way that the light bends. So plastic, it just bends the light a little bit differently. And then the other thing that I've changed, I think, under geometry, is this thin walled. So by default, all of the presets, I think, will come in as solid. So this would be like a solid plastic cast sphere. And if you want it to look more like kind of like water bottle, you would want to click thin walled, and so that creates like a shell of a material, so that the light is interacting with this object as if it was hollow. And so you can kind of start to see the differences here between the two. I think that is all of the rest that I wanted to kind of talk to you about. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, just keep playing with these. And I think, the kind of side-by-side preset option is actually really good. So if you wanted to like a thin plastic material, for instance. So maybe I can select that glass and then change it to a thin plastic material and see if there's any differences, right? And so what did they do? By default, it's like higher, that's more like glass. So glass is, remember, 1.5. There is that 0.5 antistrophy, which I think we have a little bit higher. They might have a diffuse setting. Roughness, of 1.1. And I think on the one that I had created, there was no roughness. So that's a great way to kind of like do side-by-side comparisons to see like what are the settings that are actually causing difference between these two. And actually, since I haven't played with the deep water, which I think is has an IOR of 1.3. So if I go back to my chart here, see if they used real water. Yeah, close, 35 degrees Celsius. So interesting that, of course, it will have different refraction at different temperatures. And zero antistrophy, so like the kind of reflection and distortion, I think, is what that has to do with. And then I thought there was like a little bit of like a blue tinge to this. It's probably in the specular. Yeah, here we go. So in the transmission, so there's actually not in the base color, right? So if you change the base color, so they have some sort of setting. I think maybe I should just graph it, but they have some setting that allows you not to change the base, and so that the color that you're seeing in this blue is actually just coming from the transmission. So light after it hits the object and is getting kind of scattered across the object or on the inside of the object is bouncing around with a blue scatter color. So I encourage you to kind of go in and play around a little bit with all of these settings. Interesting to see what they how they kind of interact and how they affect the kind of material properties of each one of these presets. And I hope you all have fun with this one, and I look forward to meeting up with you next week, and we'll talk a little bit about UV mapping. Super exciting. All right, have a good weekend. Take care, y'all. Bye.